thanks very much. And yeah, thanks for coming out. We got here and it was in the middle of nowhere, and then all of a sudden there was this many people. So that was super exciting. And thanks for giving us the space. This is fantastic. And for your donations. It costs a lot to make the movie, so getting some back is awesome. I can feed my kids, and we can keep moving on down the road here and hopefully keep making films like this in the future. We want to thank our hosts, Jody and Chris, back there, and we want to thank Jody for helping us put the whole tour together. And Chris, I guess, for dating Jody, whatever it is he does. Yeah, takes the cover off the pool. So I think I'll just hand it over to David here, and we'll do a little Q&A, and he'll fill you in on some stuff maybe you're interested about that you wonder in the leftover bits and pieces. All right, thank you.
Thank you for hosting this. This is fantastic. Very reminiscent of being home. I mean, a nice shop just like. Though the floor is fantastic. All right. So there's always two main questions that will pop up right away in relation to what has transpired since this was originally filmed in 2022. What happened to Bobby Ray and what happened to Bamidele Adiabo? So Bobby Ray, nobody can get a hold of him. By the time that I was first interviewed, it had been about 8 months that we had heard from him. And so we still didn't hear from him at all into 2023, but then something amazing happened in late 2023. All of a sudden he started popping up on alternative news again, blowing the whistle about Bamidele Adiabo, but also exposing other corruption that's taken place here in Canada. And so that was fantastic news for us, because we literally thought that he'd either been put in jail quietly or that he was dead. And he's not. He's on a mission. And he's moving, he's really shaking and moving things. It turns out that when they threw him into the psych ward with no grounds to do so, that it wouldn't be a deterrent for him speaking out. Because in early 2022, 2 weeks after Fact Finder 12 came out, that's when he disappeared. He was concerned about his life due to some ethnic background stuff, right, familial issues and all that. And so he went and brought those concerns forward to the RCMP, and they wanted to apprehend him before that anyways, but they didn't have the grounds to do so. There wasn't a strong enough case for criminal harassment. And so they seized the opportunity, skirted around due process of law, and threw him into a psych ward instead. Now, I've worked in mental health for 21 years now. I know people when they're mentally ill. I once was mentally ill. I grew up in a family that had severe mental illness. Bobby Ray doesn't have that. He doesn't have a clinical diagnosis for mental illness or a clinical case that would ever constitute throwing him into a psych ward. And generally when you get thrown into a psych ward, it's for 30 days. You get admitted for 30 days and generally they'll release you. They were saying that he was going to be there for 2 years if he didn't stop talking about Bamidele Adiabo. And he wasn't going to stop talking about Bamidele Adiabo. So, fortunately, a lawyer friend of his showed up at the psych ward about 6 months into his stay and saw what was going on and helped him get out. After 6 months of being in a psych ward for no just cause. So, that's the level of corruption that we're working with here. How great lengths they'll go to ensure that they will muzzle the truth, that they will prevent it from coming forward so that they can continue on with this gig. Bamidele Adiabo, state of Indiana, state of Kansas, major conflict of interest. They have an investigation open about him, but the problem is if they find that he's not a doctor, they too are on the hook for tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And so what do you think they're going to do? Bury it. Nicely, very quietly, and eerily the media is very silent on the matter. Groundbreaking news, but really the only thing that we have access to is Fact Finder 12. Nobody else would touch it. Canadian media was well aware of it. They wouldn't touch it. Even though that he was a part of the highest profile case in attacking natural health that had gone across the country, and this is a great, second chapter to it, and they're not willing to open that chapter. They're not willing to let the Canadian public know that there's some serious stuff going on here. And so they're all complicit in making sure that this cover-up is taking place. And so what they've done with Bamidele Yadiago is they've slowly and quietly reinstated him back into his position. Yeah. And not a surprise, no shocking, but not a surprise. And even though he was found guilty for that level 5 felony in the state of Indiana, which constitutes a mandatory 1-year jail sentence, he was in jail for a couple days. And then they released him, put him on probation, and gave him some community service hours. Basically a slap on the wrist, and now he's back to operating as a supposed doctor. Because I think the jury's still out on that one, really. I've gone over the evidence, and just to kind of qualify this, I'm not sure if anybody here has a medical background, but I'll just relay one clear-cut example during the court process when I was cross-examining him over the period of 5 days. At one point in time, I was trying to find out if there was any evidence of hypervolemia, which administration of too much fluids too quickly with Ezekiel that would have also caused hypoxic injury by diluting the blood so much. And so I was trying to go down that road with him, but I needed to set him up so that he established the facts. So I asked him, the first question in relation to it, how much blood per kilogram of body weight does an infant have? And it's pretty simple, right? Like, any doctor's gonna know this. And he says, maybe 10 to 20 milliliters? Like, maybe 80 milliliters is a better answer? And he actually, well, maybe it is, yeah. He had no clue. There's no way that he would have been able to qualify whether or not overdoses were taking place in relation to how much fluid somebody is receiving in anything that's being administered medically based on their weight. And it should be really simple math. And it's a slight variation. He's working with a lot of adults and a lot of infants. An adult is 70 milliliters per kilogram of body weight, and an infant's 80. And so he said 10 to 20. So he was within 4 to 8 times of being accurate. So that's the type of stuff that we were encountering in relation to him. So even if he is an actual doctor, he should not be operating as a doctor. He shouldn't be testifying as a doctor or as an expert witness anywhere. So sadly, he is still on the loose, if you will.
Where is he working?
Terre Haute, Indiana.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah, so I think he's far enough that you guys are safe from that. But don't think that you're okay here, because I've heard about the medical examiner's office out of Ontario, and it's nothing to be put up on a pedestal. So, yeah, I mean, you guys have the Dr. Charles Smith issue, right, which really was the leading case, but I don't think he was that special. I think we find those kinds of forensic pathologists all across the country. It's just that they do a better job of keeping the lid on it. So, those are the two main issues. There's two other elements I want to talk about real quickly. At one point in time, Sean Buckley says in there that this is tied for the dirtiest case I've ever experienced in my life. Yeah. The other case was the True Hope federal case when we were suing Health Canada for causing the deaths of Canadians due to their actions that they had performed back in 2003 when they limited access, or not limited, they eliminated access to our products for people that had become mentally stable and did not want to go back on medications and did not want to go back to the psych wards. And so that was the other dirtiest case that he's dealt with, because turns out, once again, the system will protect its own. Mm-hmm. And that's what the whole judiciary's main objective appears to be, is that it's there to protect the criminals within government and there to create criminals out of innocent people. And we see that way too often. The other element is that even though this is kind of old news, sadly, it's still relevant today, not just for all of us, but in the fact that Health Canada is using it today to justify bringing forth regulations to eliminate your access to natural health products. So they resurrected it in September or October of this past year, when they were being grilled by the Standing Committee on Health, and Dr. Sharma, the leading doctor for Health Canada, the Natural Health Products Directorate, she came out and stated that we have to have these types of regulations because there was a death of a young 19-month-old in southern Alberta, and then she listed one other case. And fortunately, one of the MPs knew the case that she was referring to with Ezekiel and came up with the details and tried to get her to retract her statement, saying that it's completely irrelevant, has nothing to do with natural health products, and she refused to retract that. But that's what they're using today to try to justify still removing your rights. So, we've got a battle ahead of us, and we've got a question back there.
So I may have missed it, but what did, sorry for the loss, what did Ezekiel die from? Did they ever come up with the truth?
Great question. Okay, so 2016 we didn't know. But what we had a pretty good idea about is that it wasn't bacterial meningitis. And then the evidence came out in the 2016 trial that it wasn't bacterial meningitis. But then we were left wondering, well, what was it? And so then we started looking into it as to what caused him to need the ambulance. Now, he died because of the medical intervention, or lack thereof. But what caused him to need the medical attention in the first place? That was what Colette and I were really wanting to know, right? We wanted closure. We wanted to prevent this from happening again. And so we wanted to be the wiser for it. And so what we found in the withheld evidence, as we began to dig through in 2019 when we had way more evidence, what my brother and his team found is that there was an issue with potassium, and that they had actually revived him, though they tried to cover that whole story up, because they were trying to say, well, he had bacterial meningitis. By the time he got to the ambulance, it wouldn't have made a difference anyways, because the brainstem is compressed from an intracranial pressure, and so it doesn't matter whether he gets an airway or not, it's not going to uncompress the brainstem and allow for that to function again. So that was the working narrative they're going with, but what they showed is that when they discovered during transport from Cardston to Lethbridge, is that the results of a blood gas reading came in showing that he had elevated potassium. So they gave him calcium chloride, which counteracts the elevated potassium, and within a very short period of time, like within minutes, they had to reduce him down to 25% of the heart medication that he was on, the epinephrine. He didn't need it anymore, or he only needed a small amount because his heart was starting to beat on its own, as well as he was over-breathing. The respirator had to be turned down because he was now starting to breathe on his own. So that was due to correcting the potassium, the elevated potassium issue, which will cause respiratory paralysis and cardiac arrest. Now they became concerned though, and that's when they gave him the rocuronium bromide, because they were concerned that he was going to pull out his intubation tube. And the problem is it wasn't just a high dose that they'd given him, it was also the fact that on the monographs, on the very insert that is supplied with each dose of rocuronium bromide, in the insert, it says that this is not to be administered to patients that have electrolyte imbalances, because it'll cause cardiac-related issues. And so what we found is that right after they gave him the rocuronium bromide, is literally within a minute, everything started to decline, and the last thing that we saw was a 30/20 blood pressure, which is, he's going into cardiac arrest, and he's no longer at 30/20, there's no way that he's getting blood to his brain, and he's now back into hypoxic injury. And so, and then everything went black for an hour and 5 minutes. There is no medical evidence. So we don't know exactly what took place there, but what we do know is that it appears that he had elevated potassium that caused the issue in the first place, but we still don't know why. But they treated it, he responded, and then they killed him with the medication. And, you know, and I'm not saying that they intentionally did that, that was the case there, even though he was worth a lot more alive in lawsuits than dead. It caps out at $80,000. So if he dies, I can sue them for $80,000. If he lives and he's severely impaired, I can sue them for millions and millions and millions of dollars. So there is an intent, there is a potential intention there to make sure that they're ethically removing compromised individuals that won't have a quality of life, but ironically, it's also really beneficial for them financially. But I don't believe that was the case initially. I did interview an anesthesiologist. That's all he does every day. He's a specialist. He works in the OR every single day, administering anesthetics. And I asked him, I said, hey, what do you know about this medication? He said, well, you use it all the time. I said, okay, any issues with people that have electrolyte imbalances? He said, no, not that I'm aware of. The doctors don't know it, right? They just aren't being, well, if they're being taught it, they can't possibly retain that much information because there's way too many contraindications with all the medications that they're using. So I think it was out of innocence until he got to Star's ambulance, and that's when they gave him 3 consecutive doses of the same size within a half an hour, which makes no sense. No medical expert was even willing to talk about it within the court setting. They were all trying to say, oh, actually it wasn't, no, we didn't give him that, no, those quotations right underneath the rock and bromide were not in relation to that line, whatever. And they were able to pull the wool over our eyes until we flipped the page over after the fact, and it actually had in handwriting qualifying, yes, indeed, it was 3 doses of rocuronium and bromide within half an hour. So I think that's when it was with intent. Yes? Sorry, say that again?
Were your children ever taken into government custody?
Oh, no, our children were never taken into government custody, which is actually quite unique, given this type of case. There's a lot of unique elements to this case, and that was one of them, is the fact that they never tried to steal our other children. And maybe that had something to do with the fact that they just didn't have birth certificates. Next question, yes?
Thanks for that.
Do we know which doctors were in the ambulances and the helicopter and all that? Yeah, we do. Yeah, and so we ended up getting a lot of them on the stand and cross-examining them during the whole trial process. Yeah. Now, of interest, I mean, where you're probably going with that question, or perhaps something of value to add to that, is what's interesting is when you get into the Alberta Children's Hospital, one of the most senior pediatric intensivists out of the PQ NICU unit is Dr. Catherine Ross. And here's where it gets dicey. She's the one that phoned homicide on us and tried to have us basically removed in handcuffs. And the police officer, the RCMP officer that came in and eventually got it figured out jurisdictionally with the other officers, he came in and he was actually quite decent, although he was interviewing us from 12 to 4 in the morning. But he was a decent individual, and he's actually, I believe many of you probably have heard the name Danny Bulford. Well, this is Brian Bulford, and I'm pretty sure, I can almost say with 100% certainty that they're brothers, and they are upright people. And so he was good on the case, and he actually had no recommendations for charges. He said that this is ridiculous, as being phoned for homicide. I didn't see anything to substantiate that. So he was actually in our favor. Unfortunately, the file gets to a different RCMP department and detachment, and they have an agenda. And so what's interesting, though, is going back to Catherine Ross, the one who phoned homicide on us, is that she was also involved in another case that was very reminiscent of ours. Ours was the first of its kind in Canada. There was another case that came out of Alberta Children's Hospital as well, with Jeremy and Jennifer Clark and their little son, John Wyatt Clark. And how that one went down is that he showed up in a situation that he needed help, but it wasn't dire. He was scoring a 15 out of 15 on the Glasgow Coma Scale rating, which means that all of his neurological function was fully intact. But then, within a few minutes of them identifying that he had hyponatremia, low sodium, and they began to treat him for that, there's a very specific protocol on how to treat for that, is that Dr. Catherine Ross walked in and provided a 400 milliliter bolus for a 10 kilogram baby, right? And he had just received 200 mils before that. So remember, 80 milliliters per kilogram body weight, he has 800 milliliters of blood. And within a couple minutes, they had already supplied him 600 milliliters of saline fluid, which is hypervolemia. It's going to dilute the blood, hypoxic injury. But further to that, because it's increasing its sodium at such a high rate, you can only increase sodium safely at 0.5 millimoles per liter per hour, right? He should have had his sodium brought up to normal range over 48 hours. They went over 70 times the safe rate, and the study showed that if you double the rate, the safe rate, that a lot of the participants in the studies had irreparable brain damage just from going double. They went over 70 times the safe rate. It was an absolute death sentence, and this doctor knew better, 100%. In fact, she didn't even mark it in the medical records. It was only in her personal notes, and she arrogantly let that out of the bag when she was on stand during their case, knowing that she's going to get away with it. So in essence, there was a murder that took place there, out of Alberta Children's Hospital, and the parents left 21 hours later after their son ended up in cardiac arrest twice, and had 2 major seizures twice, and they couldn't revive him on the second bout, and they left in handcuffs. So there are particular doctors that are involved in this nefarious agenda that are actually euthanizing children after they're profiling the parents and ensuring that this is a perfect case to move forward with against the people. All right, we got a lot of questions. Let's start at the front here. Yes?
Well, at the end of the movie, it talks about that you then appealed even after it was done. So what happened with that?
Unfortunately, after a year and a half of the Supreme Court having it in their hands for review, they rejected it in August of 2022. And so there is still some dirty case law coming out of the Alberta appeals courts in relation to vaccination being equivalent of a necessary of life. And yeah, basically waiting to be a baseball bat for parents here in Canada. Yes?
Well, a comment and a question. First of all, thank you so much for coming here to talk to us, and really admire your courage and your bravery. The question is, do you have any sense of what would be driving these doctors to behave that way? It seems like so mad, so out of evil, right? I mean, what would be driving? Is it money? What is it?
Well, what's of interest in both my case and Jeremy and Jennifer Clark's case, there was one character that kept on popping up who had nothing to do with it, at least on the forefront, maybe behind the scenes. And that was the bioethicist out of the University of Calgary who works in the same building that's attached to the Alberta Children's Hospital. And the bioethicist is there to determine what's ethically moral. So that would be where abortions and stuff are discussed. Now, this bioethicist is a hired gun. She's the one responsible for presenting all of the fake evidence on fluoride to get fluoride back into the water in Calgary. She's the one responsible, well, she was deemed Public Health Hero of Canada. She received that award for taking the Catholic school board and bending them over, Catholic school boards, and bending them over the barrel by creating so much public pressure against them, so that back, I believe it was 2013, that they accepted 13 different school boards across the country, accepted the HPV vaccine. And so this is the type of stuff that she's constantly involved in. And don't get me wrong, she looks like just the nicest old grandma, but she is a ravening wolf underneath, and she made her presence in both of our cases, and CBC was just giving her an open door that she could publish articles as if she was a journalist. And that's how I first came to know who she was, because in our case, she was constantly publishing articles against us, and then I actually met her in person at Jeremy and Jennifer Clark's case, and she couldn't get on my presence fast enough. And I'm like, who is this? Why is she running from me? And then I had to go do some digging and realize, Juliette Deschamps.
So it's money then. I mean, HPV folks, well documented in the US, they receive tons of money from, what was it, America? I can't remember which is from the company that produces that.
These people are bought and paid for. There's no doubt about it. Unfortunately, people are willing to sell their souls for a nickel.
Right.
Often. And so that's why we need to be people of conviction. We're willing to draw a line in the sand and say, this is as far as we go no further. And we don't see enough of that in society today, and so it becomes quite problematic. Yes?
Was this a preface to the COVID vaccine?
Oh, I believe it was, and it's interesting because it was March 2021 that they came up with that decision at the time that the COVID vaccine had already, well, I'm not going to call it a vaccine, but the COVID shot had already been out for a few months, and hesitancy was well on the rise. So I think it was absolutely to really usher that in.
Do you think that the changes that Danielle Smith is making with regard to the healthcare system in Alberta, do you think she's going to be making a difference?
Possibly. She's starting to make a difference. I'm not putting a whole lot of trust in her, but I am watching with some level of anticipation and entertainment, I guess, just watching what's going on and seeing where it goes. And obviously, you know, we'll know them by their fruits, and sometimes it takes a while for the fruits to fully ripen. And so I'm not going to put blind trust in that. So as to become apathetic to what's going on in the world and what we need to be doing on an individual level.
We know what she's up against.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's huge.
Yes. If she's truly up against it. We don't know, just be careful with the theatrics, because they love to provide us with their heroes so that it creates a sense of apathy. They become our saviors,
Yeah.
and as individuals, we become complacent, and then all of a sudden, boom, they've got us. In the cowboy hat, yes?
Yeah, thank you. Your story really hits home because my dad got a medical malpractice 43 years ago. And if I had your conviction and your knowledge and your stamina, I probably would have did things different. I did win the case. It took 11 years. But I gotta ask you this question. Do you feel that the fact that Canada signed on to Agenda 2030 and everything that revolves around it, do you think that's really the stem of the corruption we see in the medical field, the policing, the judicial system? I'd love to hear your views on that.
Yeah, if you want me to go right back to what I think the root of all of this is, it's that the world is being run by Luciferians.
Yeah.
That's the problem that we're encountering. This is the age-old battle of good versus evil. And so, yes, it's becoming quite pervasive. We're seeing it everywhere. Regardless of what face they put on, the fact of the matter is that the source is still the same, is that there is an absolute Luciferian agenda, and it's a death cult, is what it is. And so this is where the real concerns come up, is that, you know, when we're trying to fight this, we're fighting it with the idea that they need us. And in essence, if you're looking at it just from, they just want domination, they would need us. But they're looking for both domination and depopulation at the same time. So they don't care if there's collateral damage in all of this, or they don't care if they knock us down to 1/15 of the population, because that's what it would take to meet the Georgia Guidestones. Keep the population under 500 million. That's 14 out of every 15 of us gone. And so this is where we need to take this very seriously, is that this is an absolute evil agenda, and they have no care for life. In fact, they want to remove a lot of life. Yes?
Point.
I have a question, but just a follow-up statement to that. So I think there's another thing to be careful. They also want little ones to experiment on, or anybody to begin with. So it would be great if you just walked away broken-hearted and the little corpse goes off to who knows what. So congratulations to you for having stamina with this. Like, oh my God. I just want to rip that screen apart a few times. So
Don't we? Might need it again.
And did you ever at any time deal directly with Alberta public health? I watched a video or two of Alberta public health leadership in action against some of the university staff who were warning and heads of hospitals who got fired. And I was just thinking throughout that, did you ever directly interact in that area of legal team with that group?
Aside from, you know, one of their minions phoning my wife saying, hey, you know, your baby is due for vaccinations, and my wife's, you know, saying, no, that won't be happening. Aside from that, we've never had any dealings with Alberta Public Health. Yeah. Yes? Yeah.
So have you filed a lawsuit against these people, or that's one avenue to try and bring some of this truth to the surface that they're trying to hide?
Yeah, so in October of 2019, we had a major open door in relation to lawsuits. They appealed. The appeal court conveniently closed every door, reinstated the false narratives, every single thing. You know, it's amazing because in the written decision from the appeal court, you should see, it's comical now looking back at it, but you should see how they put Bamidele Adiabo up on this pedestal as this prestigious doctor. Meanwhile, while they're writing it, all of this is just falling apart. So, anyways, they closed every door possible because that would be the last standing case law on the matter that would then carry over into the lawsuit. So then we'd have to challenge that at the court, which we tried to do the Supreme Court, and that door got shut. So no, there's not a...
Did you go to the Supreme Court of Alberta or the Supreme Court of Canada?
Supreme Court of Canada. We don't have a Supreme Court in Alberta, it's called Court of King's Bench.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in essence, all of our main proceedings were in what you would call the Supreme Court on the provincial level. And so, yeah, so that's the court that rendered the decision not guilty. And then the higher court, the Alberta Appeals Courts, basically, without saying guilty, said guilty and we're going to guide the third trial. Basically, you're going to jail. Yes?
I don't know, this this is hitting so close to home in my life as well. I just have two questions, I guess, and I have to ask them both at the same time, because I'll forget. But the first is, did they push you to donate organs of your sweet boy?
Oh, yes, they did, on numerous occasions, yeah.
And did they succeed?
Okay, did they push to have us donate Ezekiel's organs?
Yeah.
Yes, they did, but did they succeed? We don't know. According to the autopsy, it's a no. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because if you actually had bacterial meningitis, and you'll see even some of the articles out there that he was septic and whatever, you would never be harvesting organs from a child like that. So, yeah. But so I don't know. I don't know how dirty it is in the chief medical examiner's office, but I wouldn't be surprised if they went and harvested the organs anyways.